lecture. Yes, welcome back. This is Global Heritage, the Age of Faith, Chapter 13. And we're going to look at the Age of Faith and the Middle Ages. How different was the attitude towards the human body and sexuality during the early Middle Ages in the West? The art of the early Middle Ages appears almost obsessed with the ideas of death and sin. The years between 850 and 1000 were a dark period for the arts in most of Europe. I would say it's a dark period for life in most of Europe. The second wave of invasions disrupted cultural and economic recovery. People found little comfort on earth and concentrated on the prospect of heavenly reward or the fear of eternal damnation. One work of art that seems symbolic of this period is a panel for the magnificent bronze doors of the Church of St. Michael's in Hildesheim, Germany. Adam and Eve approached by the Lord. This illustrates the Old Testament story in which God discovers that Adam and Eve have disobeyed him and eaten from the tree of knowledge, committing humanity's original sin. God on the left seems to convict Adam with the pointed finger of condemnation. The cowering Adam passes the blame onto Eve, who tries to hide her nakedness and point to the serpent at the same time. A comparison of Adam and Eve to any Greek or Roman nude statue immediately illuminates the change from classical to medieval artistic styles and cultural values. In the Hildesheim doors, cast in 1015, humans attempt to hide their spiny, naked bodies before God. They are ashamed to be nude. These bodies show none of the ideal beauty or athletic grace of Greek and Roman statues, and certainly none of the sensual delight of Indian carvings. This is not simply because the medieval artist is unskilled. On the contrary, the crafting of these great bronze doors was a complex project that took tremendous artistic talent, but the message of the art is anguish and guilt rather than pride and confidence, and thus calls for a new style. The Romanesque style. By the time the great doors at Hildesheim were made, Northern Europe had begun to recover from the period of invasions. The Crusades to the Holy Land were beginning to turn the militancy of warriors away from their European neighbors. Travel within Europe became safer and easier. Pilgrims streamed across Europe from shrine to shrine on foot in search of salvation. In the 11th century, a caste building program seems to have begun almost spontaneously, with monasteries erecting magnificent new churches to attract and accommodate pilgrims. So, the pilgrims, if in medieval times, if you needed special favor or compensation from God, you could travel to a church on a pilgrimage. It may take you a few days to a few weeks to travel on foot there. And when you're there, you would pray in front of a relic that would be kept in very ornate reliquary. And this would be, supposedly, a relic from biblical times, such as the bone of a certain saint's body, a old piece of wood that would be from the true cross, something like that. And now, I have to believe that with the great economic value put on people traveling to these churches, that many of these relics were not real. People believed they were real, and that brought them great distances to these churches. And while they're on pilgrimage, they needed something to eat, they needed somewhere to stay, they would buy souvenirs, things like that. So it really helped out the economy greatly. One of the most important stops on the pilgrimage route through southern France was the church of Saint-Pierre de Mozac. The most famous sculpture of Mozac is the Future of a Prophet, completed around 1115, or about 100 years after the Hildesheim doors. Carved into the trumeau, the central pillar of the main doorway of the church, is an emaciated, elongated, and extremely expressive figure of an Old Testament prophet. The body of this holy man seems to have been stretched vertically and twisted horizontally to fit into the space of the column. It is almost as if the prophet were externally awkward, trapped in a prison of stone. He is not only a man, but also a victim of a kind of divine energy. His gentle face and long flowing beard, his bony feet and writhing body all give the impression of a person who has left physical concerns and material comforts far behind. I've seen this repeated for centuries, this type of imagery of the prophet. You have to imagine that a prophet has the burden of a message from God. And they're to bring that message to mankind. But oftentimes the message is opposite of what people want to do. It sometimes is telling people that what they're doing on earth is very sinful and they need to change their ways. So the prophet is often not appreciated and welcomed into the city that he's in. He's got an incredible message, which a lot of people don't believe. It'd be like if you were standing somewhere waiting in line for a bus or waiting in line in the store to get rung up, and a person behind you says, "Hey, can I talk to you for a minute? I got a message from God, and He wanted me to tell this to you." You know, you would probably really question the mental state of this individual bringing it to you. So that's kind of the heavy burden that the prophet has. Around the year 1100, the theme of the end of the world, or the final day of judgment, became common in medieval art. Many believed this time was near. A vision of the apocalypse or end of time from the New Testament book of Revelation was carved into the entrance of the cathedral at Autun. The moment pictured is one where 4 angels blow their trumpets and the dead are resurrected to be judged. The angels appear with long, curved horns in corners of the work. The huge figure of Christ in the center dominates the composition, completely out of scale with the other figures. Close up here. On the right, horrible monsters join the Archangel Michael in the task of weighing souls. Under the semicircular tympanum on the horizontal lintel of the doorway, we see figures of the dead. On the left, prepared for heave. On the right, pushes off towards hell, heaven. Beneath the earth, the damned was in terror for their punishment. One is in the process of being plucked up by a set of disembodied hands. Classical balance and repose are totally lacking, replaced by the energy and tension. As before, nude bodies are objects of shame. The overall message is truly horrifying. Individuality and self-expression were not, however, typical of most art done during the 11th and early 12th centuries. As befitted the warlike times, architecture tended to be massive, solid, and strong. This was true not only of castles and fortresses, but of the church and monasteries. The style of these buildings is called Romanesque because they were based on the Roman building principle of the round arch. Medieval building techniques and engineering, however, were not sophisticated as those of the Romans. Whereas the Romans were able to create multi-storied structures like the Colosseum and huge open spaces like the Pantheon, medieval builders were more limited in their abilities. Heavy stone buildings were supported by thick walls. Very few windows pierced these massive walls and towers. The interiors of the churches were dark and mysterious, lit with candles. The European feudal economy could not support elaborate marble and mosaic decorations, such as those typical of Byzantine Empire or the richly decorated mosques that filled the Islamic world. The ornament was provided simply by the sculpting of the stone itself. Pisa, the cathedral, may be known for its leaning tower, but is also one of the greatest examples of Romanesque architecture. By the early Middle Ages, the basic shape of Christian churches had evolved into that of a so-called Latin cross, the long rectangular room or nave, crossed by a shorter rectangular transept which ran perpendicular to the main space. The nave is the large central space in medieval churches. Transept in a medieval church is the short rectangular space that ran perpendicular to the nave, forming the Latin cross floor plan. The very shape was symbolic of Christianity, Christ's death, and resurrection. Very heavy Roman-style rounded arches with columns on either side of the nave supported the weight of the roof. The rhythmic repetition of columns and arches created a visual sense of order and stability, but not grace. As with the Romanesque Sainte Madeleine in Vézelay, rows of columns seem to march with heavy tread like armies towards the altar. The whole shape of the church is like a rounded tunnel, a round arch extended through space to form barrel vaults. Barrel vaults are rounded arch that, when extended, allowed for large and long public spaces and stone buildings, particularly cathedrals built during the Middle Ages. And thank you, and that's the end of that lecture.